we're going to get into some generational trauma today. Really, really honing in on the fact that it didn't start with you. And I'm going to go back and forth between looking at the chat and making sure no one's popping in, but so far so good. As the lovely introduction said, my name is Devin Green. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor in the states of California and Florida. And both states were done intentionally. A very much progressive state that's open to a lot of things and doing a lot of work and a lot of the healing. And then a very, traditionally conservative state that's still dedicated to a lot of the views that they were raised on. I did so because I grew up Southern Baptist. I have seen generational trauma in generations before me and the generations after. And full disclosure, I'm a mother, so I made it a point to say it's ending with me. So with all that being said, decided to bring my treatment, my healing back to my village, as I've been instructed to do by my elders, and so on and so forth. So, and you just being present here today is you taking an active step in doing so as well. People don't think education is part of the work, but it's one of the most important components. So again, really glad you're here and hope you take away something that, motivates you to advocate for yourself and for those before and after you. So today's agenda, I'll just do, a little bit introduction of me and why I feel so passionate about this work. I will then define both generational trauma and intergenerational trauma. There is a bit of a difference there that people tend to neglect. There's a bigger picture, and then there's that internal process as far as generational legacy and genetics go. So I'm going to really dive into that. Give examples through both. Through one is such a timeline, little history of generation and generational trauma, and the other is some research case studies, since I am in research and really find that to be very much illuminating. Then I'll give you a little 5-step process on how you interrupt the cycle of trauma and generational trauma. Of course, that's going to require a lot of healing, a lot of work, but at least today I could give you some tools to prescribe to yourself, to your clients, to your family, to your loved ones, to at least get that going for you and everyone else that you're going to do this with. And then, of course, ending with some closing remarks, comments, feedback. That's when I like a lot of the participation if you feel called to do so, especially with a topic as enriched as this. So, all right, so introduction, as I stated before, when I meet a client or when you meet an individual, it's relatable to everyone. You meet someone who is either deciding to break the generational trauma or one who is actively participating in embodying and being a part of the trauma of which they either are aware or not aware of. Most likely than not, it's the second part, unfortunately. But again, at least more seminars and talks around this at least will bring more awareness into the collective and humanity in general. So you want to keep that in mind, whether you're a therapist, whether you're the client, whether you're in a relationship, but more specifically, just as being a human. And this human experience, there's the collective trauma, there's the individual, genetically inherited trauma that I'll talk about in a second. But all that to say, this is no little thing. This is deep work that needs to be looked at. This is work that needs to be taken seriously. And even if you've done years of talk therapy, it doesn't mean that you're dealing with your generational trauma. You might have just scratched the surface. This takes a very much detailed and intentional plan if you're wanting to work through this. So I'll give you a little bit more details about what we're referring to here. So first, I'm going to talk about generational trauma, then I'll talk about intergenerational. When I say generational, think bigger picture. Think of your position in the collective as society and humanity, within culture, within religion. This is kind of like that. The next slide will be intergenerational, which is a little bit more DNA genetic based, but I first wanted to make that clear distinction because people bring up generational trauma and forget to mention which one that they're speaking of. So first, generational trauma is trauma that extends from one generation to the next. It begins with a group experience. A group experience is a traumatic event that causes economic, cultural, and our familial distress. In response, people belonging to that group develop physical or psychological symptoms. And when we say group, again, it's not just a family group. It could be a cultural group, a race group, a religious group, a generational group, which we'll get into the next slide, a church group, a group at work, you know. A lot of my work at Pineapple is working with individuals that are in the adult and sex industry. So imagine the trauma that that group faces as a collective and how that's passed down to the next generation of adult and sex workers and the next one. So again, a big deal here, and I'm gonna pause just a second to check the waiting room. Okay, when we're talking about generational trauma here. So don't get too freaked out by this slide. I'm not going through every world traumatic event that's happened. I want to place close attention to this piece, the impact of historical events on generations. So again, we're thinking bigger picture here. So as I go through the particular generations and their particular traumas, think, how did that, you know, baby boomer era affect the Gen X era? How did Gen X's traumatic events and the way that they responded affects millennials, and so on and so forth. So just a little brief screenshot. We start with Silent Gen. This is 1928 to 1945. We got September 11, World War II, JFK, assassination, Vietnam War, the moon landing, Obama's elected, the tech revolution. So a lot of things going on. Civil rights movement, Iraq and Afghanistan wars start to begin there. So all of that and its influence on now the baby boomers coming in, which is 1946 to 1964. Again, and some people have lived through all these things too, so keep that in mind. So some of the same things with the addition to the Berlin Wall and the Cold War, MLK assassination. So now we've got the race riots and things being birthed there. Iraq and Afghanistan wars are still going on. We come to Gen Z, 1965 to 1980. We have the Challenger disaster dealing with, you know, NASA, gay marriages, so LGBTQIA rights are starting to come in. Hurricane Katrina, natural disasters are becoming more vicious, is when it kind of peaked there. And then the Columbine shooting. So now we've got this fear of safety in places that we're supposed to feel safe. And unfortunately, it didn't end there. We get into the millennial era, 1981 to 1996, more shootings, Sandy Hook shooting, death of bin Laden. So the violence is getting there. Maybe, you know, their fear of identity and self and safety is being threatened more within this era, which brings us to now Gen Z, 1997 to 2012. For Gen Z, they're not even on here, but off the top of my head, we've got the pandemic they've lived through. We've got the Trump era. We've got Black Lives Matters. We've got more natural disasters, from hurricanes to earthquakes now. Record high summers. It's 120 here in Miami. And I mean, the list goes on, and more shootings. And all of this is now in the era of social media, where every time you look up your phone, there's some kind of catastrophic event or tragedy or trigger, or trauma or re-traumatization. Woo! So even just going through that timeline, I'm stressed, I'm triggered, you know, so imagine living this, and imagine, you know, seeing generations before you going through it, and then witnessing it, and then having that influence on the generations after. So with that, we'll take a deeper look at, Gen Z. We're going to kind of pick on them today because they're kind of in the limelight. They're going through it, and some of them have kind of lived through from September 11 on to everything else that's happened since there. So compared to older adults, surveys have found that Gen Z from age 15 to 21 are more stressed about many vital issues. They're seeing it in the news, on social media, hearing about it from their friends, and experiencing it firsthand. And on top of that, little side note, people are very much on Gen Z about things, like they're too this, they're too that, and, you know, already a lot of negativity towards this. 75% are stressed out about mass shootings. So again, that safety piece, leading to anxiety, fear, depression. 62% are stressed about the rising suicide rates. I feel like every time, you know, unfortunately, we turn on the news, a celebrity has taken their life, or, you know, a friend, or like it's just becoming more and more common for this era. 58% are stressed about environmental concerns such as climate change and global warming. This generation is at the point where you can't ignore it. It's very much here. It's very much a problem. And that's leading to, you know, natural disasters and things around the globe that haven't happened in history necessarily. 57% are stressed about immigrant or migrant families being separated or deported, especially with recent laws going on in Florida, you know, and things going around at the border and build the wall and all this stuff. So that is probably peaking up even more since they took the survey. 53% are stressed about sexual harassment and assault. Me Too movement, we're in that era. You know, things becoming more and more common, especially within this population of the adult and sex industry. It's more almost expected or normalized. So all things that are leading to the collective trauma. And if that's like, let's say I'm a living embodiment of Generation Z, I'm experiencing that, I'm taking all this on, I'm having these mental health symptoms as an effect. Imagine my influence on my generation that's up next after me. What's being passed down? What's going to be inherited? What's going to be the expectation? Let me check on the room before I do some good news. You know, so very dark and heavy stuff. But the good news, I will say, Gen Z, they're not going down without a fight. They're protesting, they're walking out, they're going on strike. They are asking for, you know, specific pronouns. They're cancel culturing. You know, at least they're not going down without a fight, and maybe that'll be a shift. And where this cycle stops are, you know, at least being more aware of the trauma and how we pass this on, and how we have to have more responsibility in healing ourselves and healing our humanity, healing our world. You know, I think there's more, that's more their jam. So at least there's good news in that. We're just not letting it go by. But still very much impactful, to say the least. But so that was the collective generational aspect. I'm now going to get into the internal, the intergenerational. I mean, generation that is inherited, that happens on a cellular level, and that is encrypted in the DNA, if not taken care of by the caretakers and everything of that nature. So this is where it gets interesting. Intergenerational trauma is a concept developed to help explain years of generational challenges within families. It is the transmission or sending down to younger generations of the oppressive or traumatic effects of a historical event. Now, when I say historical event, I can mean something as big as slavery and the Holocaust and how that's passed on generation to generation, and that mentality and fear and anxiety and depression. I could be talking about alcoholism that runs in the family, you know, mental health disorders that are legit genetics, such as schizophrenia and things of that nature. And something as not small, but on a smaller scale, as witnessing abuse in the home, verbal, emotional, physical, witnessing dysfunctional communication and relationships. This all gets passed down to us. So a lot of times when I meet the client, I'm understanding that I'm not just treating them, I'm treating their mama, I'm treating their daddy, I'm treating their grandparents, I'm treating their lineage, really. You know, an effective therapist at least will keep that in mind and have that in their awareness. And most likely, almost more times than not, did not just start with them. So that's intergenerational trauma. I'll give a little example of that specifically in a few, but also want to shed light to the study of epigenetics. So there's a science to it now, so you know it's real. This isn't just woo-woo talk or a buzzword, but epigenetics is it studies the changes in the traits that are passed down from one generation to the next that aren't the result of changes in DNA, but the result of inherited trauma. That's how powerful this stuff is, everyone. It's changing us on a cellular level. And I'll give an example of what that may look like for you in a second here, but really just keeping in mind the impact there. So this is a picture of neuroscientist Dr. Rachel Yehuda. This is a bit further back, but her recent studies were pretty kind of recently in September of 2016. She works out of the VA hospital in the Bronx. She's dedicated her life work to looking into the root cause of PTSD within Holocaust survivors, war veterans, and victims of various types of trauma. And within her studies, she, struck some curiosity on the offspring of individuals that have been through traumatic experiences, Holocaust survivors specifically. So here you see her with little cute babies of Holocaust survivors. And she did a study on them and kind of watched them as they grew older and looked out for any developmental issues, heightened cortisol levels, stress and anything, and saw some things interesting enough that led her to do further research. So around these kids, when they became, I'm not sure the specific age, but at some point she took the blood samples of 32 children that were birthed out of Holocaust survivors. So out of 32, 22 of those babies or study participants tested positive for something called FKBP5. It's the stress gene. So her hypothesis and what her research is kind of indicating is that stress was birthed down to these babies, that those babies inherited stress. That's not a gene that's typically found within individuals that age group of which she took the study. And she even did a follow-up when they're adults, which is kind of more trickier because other stressors could have affected those results, but those same babies had the same level of stress in their blood that was inherited. So thinking, kind of full of picture there, they, for one, were probably in utero or really young or, just in an environment where all that was happening. Or, they heard stories of it happening, or they grew up in a household where, they may have been have experienced secondary trauma through discrimination or racism or anything like that. It affected them on a cellular level. So it makes you think like, okay, if I'm a person of color, if I identify as Black or Indigenous, and, I'm hearing stories of slavery and being traumatized by that, and growing up in a home where not even too long ago, where my grandma's mom was a slave and that being passed down. And, it makes you wonder, what exactly am I inheriting when I think of that full picture there? Same with growing home in a house with an abusive father. And then, I become abusive and then my child becomes abusive. It all trickles down and it all gets passed. So this is intergenerational trauma, whether it's behaviors that's getting passed down or even genetically it affecting us or influencing us in some way. So again, shouldn't be taken lightly. And I know this is deep, dark stuff, and I promise I'm going to give you some positivity here in the next slide, but just really wanting to paint the picture of how impactful that this can be, and on how it's going to take more than talking about our feelings and going to therapy and like, oh, I had a rough week. Like, no, at some point, and not overwhelming. I'm glad people are in therapy, but understanding that there's levels to it. So what do we do about it? This is heavy stuff. I don't like how I'm feeling. Like I want to stop the cycle, but it seems so overwhelming. Where do I begin? I hear you. It's a lot. But first, you want to interrupt the cycle. Like I mentioned when we began this, every person's either repeating the cycle or carrying the burden of breaking it. Whichever role it takes, it's a lot of work to deal with that trauma and kind of inherit it and have to process it when it wasn't your own to begin with, or having this awareness of the trauma and feeling like it's your responsibility to stop generations and generations and generations upon trauma dumping. It's a lot on both ends, but and no end is, there's no right or wrong way to do it. But at least, again, you walk out of here with awareness of where you reside, kind of more leaning towards. And if it just so happens to be wanting to do something about it, I'm going to give you 5 simple steps to just at least get the ball rolling on it. Again, it'll take therapy, and I'll give more specifics on what type of therapy that you can look for or request within your therapist. But for starters, first step, you want to find the source of your trauma. And that might be harder than most, when we're talking slavery or, Holocaust or, just ways that your lineage and ancestors were built. That could be a bit harder to like get a family tree and pinpoint. But if maybe alcoholism or substance use or abuse or, you could probably literally paint a family tree, but instead of, oh, that's my dad, my granddad, list the trauma. Like, okay, he abused alcohol, but his dad did too. Okay, and it started here. So what happened there? You could start to really connect the dots, but it's going to take conversations with your family. It's going to take some research, some digging. It's going to take, hey, I need your honest answers here if we're going to get to the bottom of it. But you want to find the source. That might be the hardest step, but it is the most important, and it is kind of the only way to do so effectively in healing, is finding that root cause. The second step, you want to acknowledge and accept your trauma. You don't want to be a victim to it anymore. You want to accept, okay, this, not in a way that's minimizing or making it okay, but this happened to me because that happened to my mom, and that happened to my mom's mom. And, it starts to disidentify you from the trauma and give it back to its rightful owner, which is who imposed it in the first place. But you can't do that when you're guarded. You can't do that when you're suppressing. You can't do that when you're oblivious. Like, you have to have heightened awareness and insight in order to, for one, acknowledge it and then accept it. Of course, with the support of your family, if you do have it there, and if not, your therapist, and bridging that gap for you. And number 3, you want to allow your relationships to change. If you're like me, coming from Southern Baptist, I had to cut my family off in order to heal that trauma. But then the more I processed the trauma and found the source and made the connections and realized that it didn't start with me, I became more empathetic to, okay, my mom who was only mimicking her mom, who was mimicking her mom. And I was able to reconnect out of empathy and curiosity, and most importantly, healing for myself, because I deserved it more than anyone. So now me and my mother, we're close again. We have a relationship. We're with grandma. We're just healing through healing. Just as much as a generational trauma, there's generational healing as well. And number 4, important too, allow yourself to grieve. That sucked. That's sad. I've been fighting years of this. This has been overwhelming. I can't believe this has been our family's narrative for decades. Grieve that. Grieve that. And again, in the therapy setting, with family, on your own, whatever it's going to look like. If you don't know, figure it out. Try different things until they feel good, but grieve it. I like to have little ceremonies where I write letters and I burn them in fire and watch like you could do something symbolic, whatever you need to do it and grieve it in that way. And then, of course, practice self-care. Like I said, this is heavy work. This isn't traditional CBT, DBT, talk therapy. Like, this is heavy stuff. You're not only healing your wounds, but you're healing the wounds of those before you and ensuring further wounds don't come for the ones after you. So be gentle with yourself in the process, reward yourself, do what you love, set yourself free. The last thing you want to do is re-traumatize yourself even more, right? So having that self-care routine in it as well. Sorry, I'm getting over sickness. And yeah, I'm going to leave off on this quote from a book called From My Grandmother's Hands on Radicalized Trauma and the Mending of Our Bodies and Hearts. I strongly recommend it as a read if you want to dive into generational trauma. Get into that first. Before I do that, I'm sorry, I promised that I would give other interventions. So on top of that, if we're talking therapy, you want to request trauma-informed therapy. You want to find a trauma-informed therapist, and finding someone who's maybe certified in it, trained in it. A lot of people say they're this and that. Make sure they have the receipts to prove it, because trauma work is something to like play with, okay? There's also something called intergenerational treatment model. ITM, intergenerational treatment model. And it's a whole workbook around processing generational trauma and kind of a more in-depth intervention. Something else a bit on the more woo-woo side, not evidence-based, is ancestral healing. You know, probably in places like California and there's, you know, it might be more acceptable, but I honestly took that route when I had my daughter. And I came with the intention of stopping the generational trauma with me and making sure it's not getting to her. We had a session with my grandma. We had a session with my mom. I'm pretty sure if my great grandma was alive, she would have been there too. And then we all came together in one big session. It took a span over maybe 3 months, but it did really well in echoing the narratives that I kind of got inherited without consent. It's really had them take ownership and responsibility of trauma that was their own and taking it back instead of, you know, laying it on and burdening it with me with it. You know, lots of tears, lots of emotions, but definitely worth it. Now I could, you know, when they come around my daughter, they're aware of what not to give to her, what not to pass down that isn't full of love or light. EMDR, you know, it's a form of hypnosis therapy that looks at deeply rooted trauma, and I think is super powerful and kind of becoming popular again. So if you could find someone who's EMDR, again, certified and not trained, that would be really good too. Any somatic work, you know, being in the body, residing in there is a really good way to heal trauma. And movement, I don't care if it's yoga, I don't care if it's pole dancing, you know, as long as you're moving, we're releasing stored energy in the body that could be trauma. And not only your trauma, again, generations, grandma's trauma, great-great-grandma's trauma, everyone residing within. So those are some interventions I promise. But also, of course, support groups. Pineapple offers a plethora of those if you want to check out those resources. Just whatever you do something. So there's a whole list that I just provided, and just figure out what speaks to you. So back to this quote I mentioned. Just really want you to sit with it and see what comes up. All of this suggests that one of the best things each of us can do, not only for ourselves, but also for our children and grandchildren, is to metabolize our pain and heal our trauma. When we heal and make more room for growth in our nervous systems, we have a better chance of spreading our emotional health to our descendants via healthy DNA expression. In contrast, when we don't address our trauma, we may pass it on to future generations, along with some of our fear, constriction, and dirty pain. So, brilliantly beautiful, powerful quote that summed up pretty much everything I talked about. Nervous systems, emotional health, DNA expression. Again, these are not words to take lightly. It is a big deal. And whenever the work becomes hard or overwhelming or like, more work, I think about my daughter. I think about the world that we are all collectively creating, you know, for our generations to come. Whoever's after Gen Z, I can't even keep up with the alphabet anymore, but you owe it to them. You owe it to those in the industry that are coming after you. You owe it to those part of the BIPOC communities that have been living off this narrative for so long and looking for an alternative. You owe it to survivors of trauma and assault and all these things. You know what I'm saying? And the good news though is all of this is being advocated for today. I love seeing all the strikes and the riots and the you know, the dismantling and the decriminalizing, all of that is kind of taking part in that collective piece and creating a better world for those that come after us. Um, you know, but again, looking at the family system, looking at the ecosystem, looking at all the systems and wondering, okay, what part do I play in this? It may sound like, you know, you play a little role or you're just one person, but as cliche as it may sound, one person could change the whole world, literally, or at least change on the a DNA level. Like, that's pretty intense. So never forget how powerful you are. Never forget the strength that you possess. And most importantly, never forget how your actions, behaviors, emotions, thoughts, you know, are all taken apart and you know, affecting the collective. And if that's too big of a spectrum of you know, think of your immediate family system. Even if you don't have kids, you're fur babies. I don't care. Like, I just start to think of things in that way. Yeah, so I am again, okay. I am at Devin D'shae on Instagram. If you want to kind of look more into my work and what I'm about. I'm also a proud partner, ally, advocate, and representative for Pineapple Support in the states of California and Florida. If you are looking to book with me through that realm, we offer subsidized therapy for those within the adult and sex industry. I also am a sex and relationship therapist. I'm a psychedelic assistant therapist where I utilize non-ordinary states of consciousness through ketamine, since it's legal in most states, to heal generational trauma. A lot of the work is primarily built around that. So those are my offerings. If none of them feel called to you, I hope you have enough resources and education to at least, you know, figure out where you need to go to look for help or get assistance in this topic. Yeah, and just remembering it didn't start with you, but also in the same breath, it can end with you as well. It didn't start with you, but it can end with you. Again, thanks for joining. See you at the next seminar.